Whether you lost the 50-50 for him, legitimately pulled for him, or picked him up from the standard banner with your guaranteed 1 5-star, I'm going to give you a full guide on Yanqing, his builds, his Litecoin's relic sets, and his teammates, especially given certain scenarios and with the release of characters like Yukong. I will also be talking about his pros and cons towards the end of this video, but since they are the most complicated, we're going to start off with Relics first. Now, for your main set, you can use Hunter of Glacial Forest, and the crit damage bonus it gives you is quite nice, especially considering he's going to be ulting quite often. However, for the Simulated Universe sets, you have a couple issues. You either have the Arena set, which requires you to have 70% or more crit rates. Is decent, however the problem is, Yanqing, he gets a base 60% for his ultimate no matter what. This means you're not going to be building out crit ratio on him too high, especially when you consider Sociosync gives him about 20% already. Between these two stats alone, his ultimate is going to have 80% crit ratio, meaning that you have about 20% in terms of leeway for it. Now, let's say hypothetically, you aren't using his ultimate. Then you have 20% as a starting value for crit rate. Ignoring the overcapping potential here, that means you only have to go to a maximum of 80% to max out at a 100/100 ratio. I have 40%, Sociosync gives me an additional 20 or 19, which makes it basically 60. I'm in that point not meeting out the requirements for this relic set unless I'm using my ultimate. This means in this instance, you can go for Inert Soda, which requires you to have 50% or more. With Sociosync active, you need about 30% to meet that crit ratio requirement, and the ultimate and follow-up attack damage, it's a nice bonus. Obviously not nearly as much as it would be if you dealt and got the skill damage bonus, but it's still nice enough to begin with. Hypothetically though, you can ignore both of these and can go with something like Vonwak. Now, the energy regeneration rate isn't necessarily the most beneficial. Yes, his ult is a good portion of his damage. Yes, it does deal great damage. However, the main benefit to this is the speed requirement of 120 or greater is easily met. Yanqing, as of right now on this build, has 115 speed. Keep in mind, he's running attack boots, not speed boots. Because of his major traits, he gets an additional 10%, which in this instance is about 10 speed, making him at 125 speed. At least based on my current build. Because of those requirements being met, his action forward is being advanced by 40%. And even though this isn't necessarily that big of a bonus, it means that he starts out with Sociosync active. You can use his skill once, get Sociosync, and for the rest of the fight not have to worry about it. This is far better than having him get his active bonus later on in the fight, as it's a little bit of a bonus damage, and it means you can ensure that you're always having that bonus up pretty consistently. I would actually, for the vast majority of individuals, recommend you run Vonwak for the 5% ER if you have something like Eidolons 2, which gives him an additional 10. This means you're getting 15% overall. And the reason is, at E6, if you intend on getting it, or if you have it already, the ultimate bonus and the ultimate effects consistently can range on for longer periods of time. And I know that's a bit wordy, so let me explain. Yanqing gains 45% crit damage after his ult. This is just one complete turn. So you use its ult, and then for an additional turn, you have 45% bonus crit damage. This means that in tandem with Sprightly Vonwak, you have 5% ER. In addition to his E2, you have 10% ER, making it 15% overall. And this bonus of 45% crit damage lasts an additional 1 turn, essentially meaning that you want to spam his ult out to consistently have that 45% crit damage bonus. And considering you're almost at 100% crit ratio most of the time to begin with, that is a pretty big bonus. If you wanted to increase that further, you could simulate that with somebody like Yukong, giving him a consistent bonus over time. But even then, in this instance, Yanqing, despite only using his skill, despite always having his ult up, gets that for himself and doesn't require additional support. A character like Tingyun for her damage bonus and attack can be pretty useful. That's enough about relics, because I understand that for the vast majority of you, you'll be running this Hunter of Glacial Forest set anyway, and I just think that the Simulated Universe sets are a bit iffy because you do have 3 options. This one which increases your skill damage, but has a high crit ratio requirements, this one which has a lower crit rate requirement, but doesn't increase your skill damage, and Vonwak, which is good for ult spams. You can run Space Filling Station. I just imagine that the crit bonuses here and there make your build easier overall, and the damage percent is quite nice, considering he's usually running attack percent boots anyway. But what about his light cone? Well, you have a couple options. His best will always be Sula's light cone. It's extremely good, but if you have it, you likely threw it on her to begin with. So let's ignore that. What's next? Well, if you have River Flows and Spring, which you should considering it's free, it's a decent enough light cone. I actually think that the damage bonus is quite nice overall, and considering that, essentially, in Starro, the wording for skills is quite odd. Every character who uses this skill usually has a multi-hit skill. In Sula's case, she has a 3-hit skill. In Yanqing's case, he can actually max out the bonus on certain light cones like swordplay in 1 skill duration. For this instance, his skill hits 5 times. That means as a result, he's getting this maximum damage bonus in 1 skill. And so, because Yanqing doesn't want to take damage to begin with, he's already going to have this 12% speed and 24% damage bonus at S5 pretty much all the time. All of the light cones that require you to not be hit, or all of the light cones that require multiple hits, have a increased value on him as a character as opposed to somebody like Seele, because he takes less turns to activate that buff to its fullest. Subscribe for more, even though you should, doesn't necessarily work for him in particular. Because he wants to use his ults because of that crit damage bonus, you're not going to get this passive often. Even though the 24% skill damage is quite nice, the ult is where a vast majority of his damage comes from, and you don't want to just hold on to it for no reason. I'd say that for the vast majority of you, even though cruising in the Stellar Seas is a 5-star light cone, it is not super useful for many of you, particularly because you're not going to be defeating a bunch of enemies. Yanqing is a single target damage healer. He's not AoE, and as such, Rivers Flow and Spring or Swordplay are going to be extremely good. In this instance, if you have it, I recommend Swordplay, especially at S5 over any other light cone. Because you can stack this damage buff up to its fullest in one skill, this means that you're always getting that 8% times 5 damage bonus. Only Silence Remain. This would be a good light cone. However, the vast majority of the time in Memory of Chaos, you're facing off against one boss who can summon about 4 smaller enemies. And as a result, you're not getting anything in terms of this crit rate bonus. You're only getting the attack bonus, which is nice, but not worth building up in particular for. But that's his Relics. That's his traces. What about his overall Eidolons? I'd say E1 is a good stopping point for freeze teams if you're running Gepard, March 7th. Maybe you want to run somebody like Silverwolf just to add that frost weakness, but if you want to exclude her, you can, and just swap in a Tingyun or anyone else. I'd say E1 is nice, a good damage bonus. E2 is nice for ult spam. For E4, you can get that same resistance shred by sliding in a Pela, just in case you have her. E6 further incentivizes ult spam, which further incentivizes building him out with more energy regeneration rate, and maybe an ER rope if you really have the guts to do so. As you see here, mine's running an attack, ice damage, attack, crit damage, attack, and HP. I do want to get him some better pieces, because as of right now, he's lagging behind the characters like Silverwolf and Seele. What about his team? Well, he has a few options, and subsequently is also very limited on certain teammates. You want to run a Gepard or the Preservation character, any Preservation character. It could be Fushuan if you're playing for her in the future, Gepard or Fire MC. These are basically your only options because you want them to take aggro. You have March 7th, she's good, but she also increases the aggro on the character who gets the shield, which can be counterintuitive. Gepard is his best choice as of right now. For other characters, you want a healer. That could be Natasha, that could be Bailu, it could be Lotra, it could be anybody. It doesn't really matter. In a lot of scenarios, I don't even run a healer. I instead slide in either somebody like Silverwolf, somebody like Tingyun, or I legitimately just have an imaginary character like Welt to deal additional damage and slow my opponent. Wukong can be swapped out for Tingyun. It just depends on who you want more. In this instance, Wukong gives crit, and even though the crit rate isn't necessarily needed by Yanqing, the crit damage is a nice buff. And having 2 imaginary characters means I can break weaknesses much faster. Although in a lot of scenarios, you can just slide in that Tingyun for the damage percent, the attack, and the energy regeneration rate that she gives you naturally. I'd say in terms of the middle characters, outside of your DPS, that being Yanqing, and your preservation unit, it's pretty flexible. If you have a unit like Gepard, you don't really need a healer. And if you have Yanqing, you don't necessarily need crit from Wukong. So you just need a character who can either be a sub DPS, a character who doesn't necessarily use that many skill points, like Blade, or a unit that you just have to take up space. In that case, sometimes it may be Jing Yuan, just for his lightning lord to occasionally deal damage. I'd say if you really wanted to run a debuffing team, you can go with something like this, with your Yanqing as a DPS, your Pela, and your Silverwolf to reduce resistances and add a weakness, and then your Gepard to help out a bit. Is he the best? No, he's a great character nonetheless, but he does have weaknesses compared to somebody like Seele. He doesn't necessarily have any real way to benefit himself outside of getting that additional crit rate and crit damage bonus. Yes, Seele gets speed. Yes, she gets an additional turn when she kills an enemy. But compared to that, Yanqing falls behind. The crit rate is nice and the crit damage is nice. However, he's always skill point negative because he's only using a skill, because if he doesn't, he loses Soul Steel Sync. If he gets hit, he loses Soul Steel Sync. He is reliant on that to an incredibly high degree, much more so than somebody like Seele, and much more so than somebody like Blade, who only wants to get hit. So as a result, he's a high risk, high reward character. If you build him right and you have correct supports, he can be amazing and be really easy to build out, especially early game. But if you don't have any of the supports he needs, like Gepard, he's going to fall behind other characters, especially characters who are much more resource heavy. I'd say he's worth building. I'd say he's a great character. I'd say he has good designs, and he's really easy to use. I would, however, like to remind everybody that there are other characters coming out. Kafka, Blade as of right now, you may have Fushuan in the future, and you may want to save some pulls or resources to build them first, and or see if you enjoy them. If you don't have a Gepard, I'd say maybe take a look at somebody like Fushuan to see if she can provide a shield. If she doesn't provide a shield and instead only mitigates the damage received, she's not a good support for Yanqing. If he takes any damage whatsoever, he loses Soul Steel Sync. So if Fushuan doesn't necessarily remove or stop damage from incoming, she is not good for him. By the way, if you enjoyed this, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me down below, did you build your Yanqing? Have you built out other characters, or are you considering other future units? Either way, I'll see you next time.